Elias moved through his life the way a man waded through deep water. Each step was a deliberate effort, a conscious shifting of weight against a current of memory that threatened to pull him under. The ranch was his anchor, a rectangle of dust and duty that held him in place. He mended the fences that bordered nothing, the wire biting into his leather gloves. He drew water from a well that served only him. He ate his meals standing at the kitchen counter, the food tasting of ash and obligation. The silence in the house was a physical presence, thick and heavy in the corners where dust motes danced in the afternoon light. It was a silence his wife Sarah had once filled with humming, with the clatter of pans, with laughter that felt as distant now as a foreign language. His routine was a bulwark against thought. Wake before the sun painted the eastern hills. Coffee, black and bitter. Check the 2 remaining cows, their soft eyes holding no judgment. Repair what was broken. A loose hinge, a split plank, a fraying rope. The work was honest and demanded nothing of him but sweat. It filled the hours. It tired his body so that his mind might for a few blessed hours be still. He had not slept a full night in 2 years, not since the fever had taken her, leaving behind a void that swallowed sound and light. Her things were still where she had left them. Her worn gardening gloves sat on the porch rail, curled and stiff as if still holding the shape of her hands. A half-finished piece of knitting lay in a basket by the hearth, the needles crossed in a gesture of permanent pause. He never touched them. He cleaned around them, his movements careful, reverent. To move them would be to admit a finality his heart refused to accept, even as his mind screamed the truth of it every waking moment. The door to their bedroom remained closed. He slept on a narrow cot in the small room he had once used as an office. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of his land. The town, a day's ride away, was a place of ghosts and pitying looks. He went only when necessity demanded it, for salt, for flour, for nails. Each trip was a trial, a gauntlet of well-meaning questions from people whose lives had continued, unabated. He would nod, keep his answers short, and retreat back to the predictable solitude of his ranch as quickly as the wagon would allow. His isolation was a choice, a shield he held up against a world that no longer made sense. He ran a hand over the worn handle of his father's smithing hammer. It lay on the workbench in the barn, a place he rarely went anymore. Sarah had loved the sound of it, the rhythmic ringing of steel on steel. She had called it the ranch's heartbeat. The barn had been silent for 2 years. The forge was cold, its brick maw dark with soot and disuse. The hammer was a relic of a life he no longer lived, a testament to a strength he no longer possessed. It was the last piece of his father he had, and the last piece of the man he used to be. The trip to town was unavoidable. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the last of the salted pork was gone. He hitched the old mule to the buckboard, the familiar creak of the leather and would a mournful sound in the morning quiet. He did not look at the house as he left. He focused on the ruts in the road, the way the dust kicked up in a fine brown cloud behind him. The sun was a hot, indifferent weight on his shoulders. The world felt brittle, bleached of all color. He saw them before he even reached the butcher's shop. A small crowd had gathered, their interest a mix of morbid curiosity and casual cruelty. In the center of it stood Miller, the butcher, a man whose girth was matched only by his smugness. And beside him, her head held high despite the raw, red chafe of a broken manacle on her wrist, was an orc woman. She was tall, built with the dense muscle and broad shoulders of her people, but she was thin, her green skin pulled taut over her cheekbones. One of her arms hung limp at her side, clearly broken, the angle of it unnatural. A small orc child, a boy no older than 5, clung to her leg, his tusks barely emerged from his gums. He glared at the onlookers with a ferocity that his small frame could not possibly back. Miller was holding a piece of paper, a contract of indenture. Strong back, good for field work or hauling, he announced to the crowd, his voice slick with commerce. Slightly damaged, but the price reflects that. Who'll start the bidding? A year's labor for a pittance. No one spoke, they just stared. Orcs were not a common sight, and indentured ones even less so. They were a proud, reclusive people who kept to the mountains. To see one here, in chains, was a grim spectacle. The woman's eyes swept over the crowd, and for a moment they met Elias's. There was no plea in them. There was only a cold, hard fire of defiance, banked but not extinguished. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of someone who had lost everything but was not yet broken. "She's useless with that arm," someone muttered. Miller's face soured. He grabbed the orc's good arm, and she flinched, a sharp intake of breath the only sound she made. The child growled, a low, guttural sound from deep in his chest. "The arm will heal," Miller snapped. "She's tough. They all are." Elias felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a cold knot of something he had refused to feel for a very long time. It was anger. It was the sight of the child, his small hands balled into fists, trying to protect his mother from a world that was too big and too cruel. It was the woman's dignity, a fortress under siege. He thought of Sarah, of her fierce protectiveness, of the injustice of her fate. The world had taken her, and he had done nothing. He had simply stood by and let the silence win. He found himself moving, his feet carrying him forward before his mind had fully consented. The crowd parted for him, their faces registering surprise. Elias rarely spoke to anyone, let alone involved himself in public affairs. "I'll take the contract," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Miller turned, his eyes lighting up with greed. "Elias, didn't see you there. Wise man, a good worker is what that ranch of yours needs." He named a price, an exorbitant sum that he knew Elias could not possibly have. It was a humiliating amount, designed to put him in his place. Elias's pockets were nearly empty. He had just enough for flour and salt, and not a cent more. The faces of the townsfolk swam before him, a sea of pity and expectation. He was the grieving widower, the man who was letting his family's legacy crumble into dust. He could feel their judgment like a physical weight. He could turn around, get his supplies, and ride back to his quiet, empty life. It would be the sensible thing to do. It would be the safe thing to do. He looked at the orc woman again. She was watching him now, her expression unreadable, guarded. The boy was peering at him from behind her leg. In that moment, the choice was not between logic and compassion. It was between the man he had become and the man Sarah had married. He turned without a word and walked back to his wagon. The crowd murmured, assuming he had given up. Miller chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. Elias reached under the driver's seat and pulled out a heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He walked back to the butcher and unwrapped it. It was his father's hammer. The head was forged from dark, heavy steel, perfectly balanced. The handle was hickory, worn smooth and dark with the sweat of 2 generations of honest work. It was the only thing of real value he had left, not in coin, but in memory. He held it out to Miller. "This, for the contract." Miller's eyes widened. He was no smith, but he knew quality. He knew the work that went into a tool like that, a tool that could last 100 years. He knew what it meant to a man like Elias. He licked his lips, his greed warring with his surprise. To take this hammer was a cruelty beyond the simple transaction of coin. It was taking a piece of the man's soul. He took it. The hammer felt unnaturally heavy in his hand. He tested its weight, a grotesque imitation of a craftsman. "Done," he said, a grin splitting his face. He handed the flimsy contract paper to Elias and used a key from his pocket to unlock the shackle on the woman's good wrist. The metal fell away, leaving the broken piece still encircling her other. Elias did not look at the hammer. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He nodded once to the orc woman. "Come," he said. It was not a command, but a simple statement. He turned and walked back to his wagon, not looking to see if she followed. He heard the soft shuffle of her feet on the dusty street, and the smaller, quicker steps of the child beside her. The crowd watched them go, their silence now one of confusion and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. Elias had traded his past for a future he could not begin to imagine. He had bought 2 strangers with the last remnant of his old life, and he had no idea what he was going to do with them. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent affair. The woman and her son sat in the back of the buckboard, rigid and watchful. Elias kept his eyes on the mule's ears and the familiar road ahead. The silence was different now. It was not the empty silence of his grief, but a tense, charged silence filled with unspoken questions and deep-seated mistrust. He could feel her gaze on his back, heavy and assessing. What had he done? He had brought 2 more mouths to feed to a ranch that could barely support one. He had invited complication into a life he had painstakingly simplified. He had acted on an impulse, a ghost of a feeling he thought had died with his wife. He felt a surge of panic, cold and sharp. He glanced back. The boy had fallen asleep, his head resting on his mother's thigh. She was stroking his hair, her large scarred hand surprisingly gentle. Her face, in that unguarded moment, was not hard or defiant. It was weary. It was the face of a survivor who was tired of surviving. The panic in Elias's chest subsided, replaced by a quiet, grim resolve. He had made this choice. He would see it through. They arrived as dusk was settling, turning the sky to a bruised purple and orange. The ranch house looked small and lonely against the vast expanse of the plains. He pulled the wagon up to the barn and unhitched the mule. The woman did not move until he was done. She watched his hands, his efficient, practiced movements. "There's a spare room," he said, gesturing toward the house. "It's small, but it's dry." She slid off the back of the wagon, lifting her sleeping son into her good arm with a grunt of effort. She followed him to the house, her steps slow but steady. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dust. He led her to the room he had once used for storage. It held a simple cot, a small table, and a clean, threadbare blanket. It was sparse, but it was clean. She laid the boy on the cot. He did not stir. She turned to Elias, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. Elias had no answer. He did not know why. He shrugged, a gesture of helplessness. "You needed help." Her expression did not change. Trust was not a thing that came easily to her. He could see that. It had been beaten and sold out of her. "I am Gorza," she said. "This is my son, Cale." Elias. An awkward silence stretched between them. He was a stranger. She was a stranger. They were 2 solitary beings, thrown together by a desperate act. He cleared his throat. "I'll make something to eat." He went to the kitchen and started a fire in the stove. He moved with the clumsy uncertainty of a man unaccustomed to cooking for others. He sliced potatoes and onions, his movements stiff. He found a piece of bacon and fried it, the smell filling the quiet house. It was the first time in 2 years that the scent of a real meal had permeated the walls. He set 2 plates on the small kitchen table. He was about to call for her when she appeared in the doorway, a silent shadow. She moved to the table and sat, her posture erect. He served the simple meal, and they ate without speaking. He watched her eat. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each mouthful. He realized she was probably starving. The boy, Cale, remained asleep in the other room. When they were finished, she stood and gathered the plates. She took them to the wash basin, but hesitated, looking at her injured arm. "I'll do it," Elias said, his voice too loud in the stillness. He took the plates from her. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was cool and rough, like stone. She pulled her hand back quickly. She stood there for a moment, watching him wash the dishes. Then, with a curt nod, she retreated to her room and gently closed the door. Elias was left alone in the kitchen, the unfamiliar warmth of the stove at his back. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer empty, it was occupied. The first week was a careful dance of avoidance. They moved through the small house like ghosts, occupying the same space but never at the same time. He would rise early and be out of the house before she and the boy were awake. He would leave food on the table for them. When he returned in the evening, she would be in her room, the door closed. The only evidence of her presence was a clean kitchen and the faint scent of the soap he had left for her. He worked on setting the bones in her arm. He was no doctor, but he had set enough broken legs on calves and foals to know the basics. She bore the pain with a stoicism that unnerved him. She sat on a stool in the barn, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall as he manipulated the bones back into alignment. Cale stood nearby, his small hand clutching a piece of wood, his eyes wide with fear and anger. He watched Elias as if he expected a blow to fall at any moment. "This will hurt," Elias had said, his hands gentle on her arm. "It has already hurt," Gorza had replied, her voice flat. He fashioned a splint from scrap wood and wrapped it tightly with strips of clean cloth. Her arm would be useless for weeks, but it would heal straight. It was the best he could do. After that, she began to emerge more from her room. She could not do heavy work, but she was not idle. He found her one afternoon in the neglected vegetable garden, painstakingly pulling weeds with her one good hand. Cale was beside her, mimicking her movements, his small brow furrowed in concentration. He watched them from the porch. Sarah's garden had been a riot of color and life. Now it was choked with weeds, a testament to his neglect. Gorza was patiently clearing a small patch around the struggling tomato plants. She was bringing a small piece of his world back to life, a piece he had abandoned. He felt a pang in his chest, a complex emotion he could not name. It was not quite gratitude, not quite guilt. It was something new. He began to leave tools for her on the porch, a small hand trowel, a pair of shears. He never said anything. He would just leave them there, and in the evening they would be back, cleaned and resting by the door. They were communicating through objects, through shared, unspoken tasks. It was a language they both understood better than words. Cale slowly began to thaw. He would follow Elias around the ranch at a safe distance, a small, silent observer. One day, as Elias was repairing a section of fence, Cale spoke to him for the first time. "Why is that wood broken?" he asked, his voice clear and high. Elias looked down at the boy. "It got old, worn out by the sun and the rain." "Will you fix it?" "I'm trying," Elias said. Cale seemed to consider this. "My father fixed things," he said, a statement of fact with no self-pity attached. He was strong. Elias paused, his hammer resting on the fence post. "I'm sure he was." After that, the boy's questions became a regular occurrence. They were simple, direct, and often uncomfortably perceptive. "Why is your house so quiet?" he asked one evening. "Why are your eyes sad?" Elias found he had no easy answers. The child's innocent honesty chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. It was impossible to maintain his stoic reserve in the face of such relentless, guileless curiosity. The barn became the center of their shared world. The roof had a hole in it, a gaping wound from a winter storm 2 years ago that he had never found the will to repair. He decided it was time. It was too big a job for one person, especially one who had lost the habit of such ambitious work. He dragged the long, heavy timbers into place. Gorza watched him for a day, her expression thoughtful. On the second day, she was there beside him. Her arm was still in a splint, but she used her good arm and her body to brace the beams while he hammered them into place. She was surprisingly strong, her movements economical and precise. They worked together in a rhythm born of necessity, a silent understanding passing between them. He would gesture, and she would move. She would see a tool he needed and have it in his hand before he asked. The work was hard, but it was good. The sound of the hammer striking nails rang through the air, the first real noise of industry the ranch had heard in years. It was not his father's hammer. That was gone. This was a new one, a plain, functional tool he had bought in town. But in his hands, it felt right. He was building again. He was repairing. One afternoon, as they worked, Cale brought him a cup of water. Elias took it, his throat dry from dust and exertion. "Thank you," he said. The boy gave him a small, hesitant smile, showing the tips of his tusks. It was the first time he had seen the child smile. The warmth of it spread through Elias's chest, a small, fragile thing. That evening, they sat on the porch, too tired to move. The sun was setting, bleeding across the horizon. The air was cool and smelled of cut pine and dry earth. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was comfortable, companionable. "Sarah planted those," Elias said, his voice quiet. He gestured to the wild tangle of rose bushes that grew along the porch. "She said a house wasn't a home without something that was alive just for the beauty of it." It was the first time he had said her name to another person since the funeral. The word felt strange on his tongue, both a pain and a relief. Gorza was silent for a long time. She watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the hills. "My mate, Gruel," she said, her voice a low murmur. "He was killed by men who wanted our land. They said we were trespassing on a place our people had lived for 1,000 years." She spoke without emotion, her words a simple, brutal statement of fact. He was a carver. He could make wood look like living water. They sat there for a while longer, two people from different worlds, united by a shared geography of loss. The chasm of their differences, human and orc, buyer and bought, seemed less important than the common ground of their grief. He had not shared his pain with anyone. She had likely had no one to share hers with. In that quiet moment on the porch, a fragile thread of understanding was woven between them. The next day, Elias went to his forge. He fired it up for the first time in 2 years, the roar of the bellows a startling sound in the silent barn. He took the broken piece of the manacle from Gorza's wrist, the piece he had removed when he set her arm. He heated the metal until it glowed a furious orange, the color of the sunset. He worked the steel with the new hammer, not his father's, but his own. The ringing of the anvil was a song of transformation. He did not try to make something beautiful. He was not an artist. He was a practical man. He forged the iron into a simple, sturdy garden trowel. He shaped it, tempered it, and fitted it with a smooth wooden handle. It was a good tool, strong and well-balanced. He left it on the porch that evening, in the spot where he usually left the other tools. He said nothing. The next morning, it was gone. Later that day, he saw her in the garden, using the trowel to clear the earth around Sarah's rose bushes. She moved with a careful, focused grace, tending the living things that had been left behind. She was not just weeding, she was cultivating. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. A new routine settled over the ranch, a rhythm of 3 instead of 1. Cale's laughter became a common sound, echoing off the barn walls as he chased chickens or helped Elias feed the cows. Gorza's arm healed, the splint coming off to reveal a puckered scar and a slight crook in the bone. But the limb was strong. She worked alongside Elias, her strength and competence a quiet, constant presence. They rebuilt the collapsed section of the barn, re-roofed the chicken coop, and cleared a new field for planting. The ranch was slowly coming back to life. The work was endless, but it was no longer a solitary struggle against decay. It was a shared project, a mutual investment in the future. The house no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. There were scuff marks on the floor from a child's boots, the smell of Gorza's cooking, a savory stew with wild herbs she gathered from the hills, and the low murmur of conversation in the evenings. Elias found himself changing. The tightness in his chest had begun to loosen. He still missed Sarah with an ache that was a part of him, but the grief was no longer an all-consuming darkness. It was a room in his heart he could visit, not a prison in which he lived. He started sleeping in his own bed again, the one he had shared with her. The first night was hard, the space beside him a cold, vast emptiness. But he woke to the sounds of life in his house, Cale's chatter, the clatter of Gorza in the kitchen, and the emptiness felt a little smaller. One evening, Gorza was sharpening a scythe, the whetstone whispering against the steel. Cale was on the floor, carefully carving a piece of scrap wood with a small, dull knife Elias had given him. Elias was mending a leather harness, the familiar work of his hands a comfort. "The contract," Gorza said without looking up from her work. "The paper you have. The season is almost over." Elias stopped his work. He had almost forgotten about the flimsy piece of paper tucked away in a drawer. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It matters," she insisted, her eyes meeting his. "I have worked for my place. I am not in your debt." Her pride was a fierce, unbending thing. She was his partner, not his property. It was important to her that he understood that. "I know," he said softly. "This is your home, Gorza, if you want it to be." Her gaze held his for a long moment, searching. Then she gave a single, sharp nod and returned to her work. The matter was settled. They were not master and servant. They were not even employer and employee. They were something else, something they had not yet found the word for. They were a family. The dust cloud on the horizon appeared just after noon. It was too large for a lone rider, too purposeful for a stray herd. Elias watched it from the porch, a cold feeling coiling in his stomach. He had known this day might come. He had hoped it would not. It was Miller. He was not alone. He rode a stout horse, and flanking him were two men Elias recognized as transient laborers, men who would do anything for a few coins. They rode into his yard and stopped, their presence an immediate violation of the peace he had so carefully rebuilt. "Elias," Miller said, his voice oozing a false friendliness, "just came to see about my property. The season's indenture is up. Time to collect." Gorza had come out of the house to stand behind Elias. Cale peeked out from behind her legs, his small face a mask of fear. "She's not your property, Miller," Elias said, his voice low and steady. He did not move from the top step of the porch. He was not a large man, but he stood his ground, a quiet, immovable object. Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I have a contract, signed and sealed. Her labor is mine to sell, and I've got a good price for her from the Black Creek mining crew. They don't mind a bit of orc muscle." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. The implication was ugly and clear. "The hammer paid for the contract in full," Elias said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "That was the deal." "The hammer paid for her for the season," Miller countered, his smile turning venomous. "A rental, you might say. Now the rental period is over. Hand her over, or we'll take her. And the boy. He'll fetch a decent price as a cabin boy." Rage, pure and hot, surged through Elias. It was a feeling so intense it almost made him dizzy. He had spent 2 years numbing himself to the world, and now this man, this vile excuse for a human being, had brought it all roaring back. He thought of the hammer Miller had taken, the symbol of his heritage. He thought of Gorza tending Sarah's roses, of Cale's hesitant smile. This was his home. These were his people. "You're not taking anyone," Elias said. Each word was a piece of flint. He stepped down from the porch. He did not have a weapon, but he did not need one. His entire being was a weapon, forged in grief and now tempered by a fierce, protective love. Gorza moved to stand beside him. In her good hand, she held the heavy wood axe she had been using to split logs that morning. She did not raise it in a threat. She just held it, its weight a settled, deadly promise. She was not a victim to be rescued. She was a defender of her home, standing shoulder to shoulder with her partner. Miller's smile faltered. He had expected a broken man, an easy mark. He had not expected this united front, this quiet, absolute defiance. His hired men shifted uneasily in their saddles. This was supposed to be a simple collection, not a fight to the death. "This is foolish, Elias," Miller snarled. "I've got the law on my side." "Then go get the law," Elias said. "But you're not setting foot on this porch." He made his stand then, not just for Gorza and Cale, but for himself. He drew a line in the dust, a line between the life he had been passively enduring and the life he was now actively choosing to build. He was claiming them. He was claiming his own future. "She is part of this household," he said, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even him. "This is her home. This is her son. You will leave them be." The standoff stretched, thick and tense. The only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the barn and the nervous stamping of the horses. Miller's face was red with fury, his bluff called. He was a bully, not a killer. He needed his victims to be afraid. These people were not afraid. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, another sound joined the wind. It was the rattle of a buggy, its wheels crunching on the gravel of the lane. It was Doc Allen, the town's physician, on his way to the neighboring homestead. He pulled his horse to a halt, his old, wise eyes taking in the scene in an instant. Miller and his thugs, Elias and Gorza standing together, the child hiding behind them. "Afternoon, Elias," the doctor said, his voice calm and authoritative. He tipped his hat to Gorza. "Ma'am." He then fixed his gaze on the butcher. "Miller, causing trouble, are we?" "This is none of your concern, Doc," Miller growled. "This is a business matter. Seems to me a man threatening a family on their own land is everyone's concern," Doc Allen said mildly. He had delivered Elias. He had treated Sarah in her final days. He knew the weight of the hammer Elias had traded. He looked at Miller with a gaze that was cold with contempt. "I saw the bill of sale for that indenture contract, Miller. You bought it for a pittance off a bounty hunter who had no legal claim. It wasn't worth the paper it was printed on then, and it isn't now. You're trying to sell property you never owned." The doctor's words hung in the air, a public declaration of Miller's fraud. The hired men looked at each other, then at Miller. They were hired for muscle, not for a legal battle with a respected town elder as a witness. One of them slowly shook his head. The job was no longer worth the pay. Miller's face contorted in a mask of impotent rage. He was beaten, not by force, but by truth and community. He had lost. He spat one last time into the dust, a final gesture of his foulness. "This isn't over," he hissed, but the threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his hired men following sheepishly behind him, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in their wake. Elias stood watching them go, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving him shaky but solid. He felt Gorza's presence beside him, a warm, steady anchor. Cale emerged from behind her and, in a gesture of absolute trust, took Elias's hand. The boy's small fingers wrapped tightly around his. Doc Allen gave them a long, appraising look, a small smile touching his lips. He nodded once, a gesture of profound approval. "You did good, Elias," he said. "You did right." He clucked to his horse and the buggy rattled on its way, leaving the three of them standing together in the quiet yard. That night, the silence in the house was a comfort, a shared peace earned through trial. After they had put Cale to bed, Elias took the indenture contract from the drawer. He walked to the hearth and without ceremony dropped it into the low-burning flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Gorza watched him from the doorway. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I would have worked to pay the debt you saw." Elias turned to face her. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small room feel like a sanctuary. "There was never a debt," he said. "This was never a contract. It was a choice. I chose." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an orc, not as a worker, but as the woman who had brought his home and his heart back from the dead. He saw the strength in her eyes, the resilience in the line of her jaw, the quiet intelligence in her gaze. "I choose this," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was only just beginning to understand. "I choose you. And Cale, if you will have this life, with me." She crossed the room and stood before him. She reached out, not with her good hand, but with the one that had been broken. She gently touched the side of his face, her rough fingers a surprisingly tender caress. Her eyes were shining in the firelight. "We have built this life together, Elias," she said softly. "It is already ours." The seasons turned. The newly cleared field yielded a modest but sufficient crop of corn and beans. They bought 2 more cows with the money from the harvest. The sound of Cale's laughter was a constant melody, and the ring of Elias's hammer from the barn was once again the ranch's heartbeat. The house was filled with the sense of baking bread and the low hum of their mingled voices. One spring afternoon, Elias watched from the porch as Gorza and Cale worked in the garden. Sarah's roses, pruned and tended with loving hands, were exploding with blossoms of deep, velvety red. Cale, now a sturdy boy of 6, was carefully watering a row of new seedlings. Gorza looked up and saw Elias watching. She smiled, a true, broad smile that transformed her face, and he felt his own lips curve in response. A family was not a thing you were given and then lost. It was a thing you built. It was a choice you made every day. It was a structure you repaired when it was broken, a garden you tended, a future you forged, piece by piece, from the most unlikely materials. It was a home. He had a home.